Near midnight, the message annex sounded like a shop that never closed. Fans whispered behind grates. A thermal printer clicked as it pressed custody seals onto thin gray envelopes. In the restoration bay, the air held disinfectant and warm circuitry. Maren Wyle sat at the voice-stitch console with a headset cupped to one ear. She had learned to listen for what machines missed. On the screen, a waveform crawled in pale lines. Jagged where radiation storms had chewed the packet during relay hops. A tray beside her held final packets. She did not read the names early. Names turned tasks into funerals. She loaded the top envelope. The console accepted it with a soft chime. Static breathed from the speakers, then tightened into a voice. Recipient, Tamsin Rowe. Sender, Private Kale Rowe. The file showed his training voiceprint, recorded before deployment so restoration could recognize his cadence. Maren pressed play. A man inhaled, too close to the microphone. The breath was fast, then caught, as if he was speaking through pain. Under it, a distant thud repeated, steady enough to be real. "Mom, if you get this, it means." The sentence broke into grit. The restoration smoothed the gap and returned a clean phrase that did not belong. Maren stopped playback. She ran the raw track. The raw audio crackled. The breath stayed. The thud stayed. The words fractured where they should have fractured. She replayed the rebuilt line. The voice sounded like Kale. Yet the rhythm was wrong. Too even. Too rehearsed. "Mom, if you get this, it means I'm at peace." Maren's fingers went cold. That sentence calmed families. It also showed up when someone wanted them calm. She pulled up Kale's profile and listened to his training clip. He clipped consonants when he was nervous. He rushed when he lied. The inserted line floated, as if spoken by someone who had never been afraid. Maren opened the custody ledger. 3 relays. 1 inland switch. No warnings. No delays. The trail looked perfect. Perfect trails were rare. War made everything messy. She examined the envelope seal. It was intact, but the ink looked fresh. Too fresh for a packet that had traveled the frontline arc. Maren marked the segment as a variance and queued it for deeper integrity review. The console asked for a token she did not have. Access denied. She stared at the denial until her eyes stung. She thought of her sister, Sarah Wyle, who had shipped to the ark and never came back. No message had arrived, only the official notice, polite and empty. Maren saved the raw audio in a private buffer and locked the session. The night shift rule said do not improvise meaning. It did not say what to do when meaning had been written for you. In the corridor outside, a cart rattled past and someone hummed to stay awake. Kestrel Harbor kept itself alive by turning dread into routine. Maren looked at the paused waveform and felt a new weight settle in her chest. The truth had not disappeared. It was being shaped. An hour later, the corridor lights dimmed for the energy cycle. The restoration bay took on the color of cold tea. Maren rubbed her eyes when the outer door unlocked with a precise, unfamiliar rhythm. A tall figure stepped in, carrying a hard case. Their skin held a faint dusk tint under fluorescence. Their eyes reflected the console screen like polished stone. Maren stood. Maren said, "Can I help you?" The visitor paused at the threshold, respectful of the room. Kez said, "Kez Talren, Signal Integrity Guild, temporary assignment." Maren had heard of the guild the way people heard of distant storms. They arrived when systems failed in ways locals could not explain. Kez set a plain badge chip on the bench. Kez said, "Homefront stability requested cross-check support. Radiation shear is increasing. The relay belt is losing coherence." Maren nodded toward the console. Maren said, "I am already tracking an integrity variance." Kez moved closer, careful not to crowd her. Kez said, "Play it." Maren loaded the row packet and ran the suspect segment. Kez listened without blinking. When the smoothed sentence resolved, Kez's pupils narrowed. Kez said, "Replay raw." Maren did. The raw track broke apart, then stuttered back. The inserted phrase was absent, replaced by a gap that the machine should have struggled to fill. Kez pointed at the waveform edge. Kez said, "This is not inference. It has a human signature." Maren felt her jaw tighten. Maren said, "You mean someone wrote the sentence?" Kez said, "Yes. Then they wrapped it in noise to look like kindness." Maren dragged up the custody ledger again. Maren said, "The trail is clean." Kez said, "Clean trails are designed. Natural trails are messy." Maren kept her voice steady. Maren said, "If I report tampering, the packet goes into freeze. A mother waits longer, sometimes forever." Kez's tone softened by a fraction. Kez said, "If you pass it through, she may hear a voice that was never her son's." Maren stared at the recipient name again, letting it become real. Maren said, "What can you do?" Kez opened the hard case. Inside were calibration patches and a small recorder with an optical port. Kez said, "I can trace the insertion signature to a stage. That can justify a vault request." Maren watched Kez work, placing patches on the speaker housing, measuring distortion. The movements were careful, almost reverent, as if the machine was a witness. Maren said, "Why does the guild care?" Kez did not look up. Kez said, "In my culture, a last message is a contract between the living and the dead. Altering it breaks the contract." Maren thought of contracts too. Enlistment forms, ration pledges, the quiet agreements families made to survive. Maren said, "Here they call it morale management." Kez met her eyes. Kez said, "Names do not change what it is." Maren felt tired anger flare, then settle into resolve. Maren said, "All right, trace it. I will request the original vault copy." Kez nodded once. Kez said, "We do this together." For the first time that night, Maren felt less alone in the glow of the waveform. In the deepest quiet of the night cycle, Maren drafted the request 3 times and deleted it twice. Each version sounded like an accusation, and accusations were dangerous in Kestrel Harbor. She submitted a third version, bland and procedural, variance, integrity confirmation, chain of custody verification. The system returned a single line. Insufficient clearance. Maren stared at it. Kez stood behind her, hands clasped, waiting as if a court had spoken. Kez said, "There is a higher channel. The Directorate of Homefront Stability." Maren swallowed. Maren said, "They are the channel." The outer door opened again. This time the footsteps were meant to be heard. 2 Dome Security Bureau officers entered first. Uniforms neat, posture calm. Their hands rested near restraints, not weapons. Behind them walked a man in a simple dark coat. He did not wear medals. He did not need to. His presence carried the weight of forms that could erase careers. Director Varric Sloan. He looked around the bay as if he owned the air. Then he offered a small, practiced smile. Sloan said, "Maren Wyle, working hard while the city sleeps." Maren stood with her hands visible. Maren said, "Director Sloan, I filed an integrity request. It was denied." Sloan said, "It was routed correctly, which means it reached me." Kez stepped forward half a pace. Kez said, "Signal Integrity Guild requests access to the original vault copy for this packet." Sloan's gaze flicked to Kez, then returned to Maren. Sloan said, "We respect the guild, but there are realities you may not feel from inside this room." Maren said, "The packet contains an inserted sentence." Sloan nodded as if she had mentioned a power dip. Sloan said, "We call it smoothing." Kez said, "It is alteration." Sloan's smile did not move. Sloan said, "Words again. You hear a broken thing and you want to fix it perfectly. I respect that." Maren said, "A mother will hear a voice that is not her son's." Sloan walked closer to the console without touching it. Sloan said, "A mother will hear a voice that keeps her from breaking in public. She will keep feeding her neighbors. She will keep her hands steady during the outages." Maren felt bile rise. Maren said, "You cannot know that?" Sloan said, "I can. We have learned the cost of raw truth delivered without support. We have seen panic become stampedes. We have seen grief become sabotage." Kez said, "Then support them. Do not rewrite them." Sloan's eyes cooled. Sloan said, "Support requires bandwidth. Bandwidth is being spent on keeping the arc from collapsing. Every resource you demand here is taken from someone bleeding in vacuum. Maren heard the distant thud in Kale's packet and imagined it as a heart. Maren said, "Is there a protocol for this?" Sloane inclined his head. Sloane said, "The soft lie protocol. A kindness calibrated to prevent collapse. You do not have to like it. You only have to understand why it exists." Maren tried to keep her voice calm. Maren said, "Then let families choose. Offer the smoothed version and the original." Sloane's smile returned, thinner. Sloane said, "Choice is a beautiful word. In war, choice destroys coordination." Sloane lowered his voice, just enough to make it feel private. Sloane said, "Tell me, Maren Wyle, do you want to save one family tonight? Or do you want to burn a city?" Maren's breath caught. The question was not a metaphor. It was a warning wrapped in a moral puzzle. Kez answered evenly. Kez said, "Truth does not burn cities. Lies do, eventually." Sloane straightened. Sloane said, "Eventually is a word the dead do not get to use. Our job is to keep people alive now." Sloane gestured to an officer. A small device slid into the console port. A log window opened. Maren saw her access attempts. Cleanly recorded. Sloane said, "Your name has been flagged for enhanced monitoring. This is not punishment. It is safety. You are tired. You are passionate. Those traits are useful. They are also risky." Maren said, "Am I still authorized to work?" Sloane said, "Of course. We need you. We do not need you to carry burdens that belong to policy." Kez said, "And my access?" Sloane said, "The guild may assist with stabilization. No extraction without clearance." Sloane turned toward the door. Sloane said, "Go home when your shift ends. Eat, sleep. Tomorrow will be hard enough without extra fires in the night." When the door shut, the bay felt smaller. The air seemed to hold his smooth words like residue. Maren looked at the row packet waiting in the queue. A mother on the other end of a message that was becoming something else. Kez spoke quietly. Kez said, "They are not hiding it." Maren whispered. Maren said, "They are normalizing it." The log window remained open. The final line glowed in amber. Monitoring enabled. As the first hint of morning pressed against the dome, Maren understood the truth had not vanished. It had simply chosen a new person to carry it. Late the next afternoon, Kestrel Harbor moved with practiced quiet. Dome lights dimmed into a mild, artificial dusk. Maren Wyle carried a sealed case from the message annex to the Office of Civic Closure. Feeling the weight like a warning pressed to her ribs. The lobby held rows of chairs and a wall screen looping calm scenery. People waited without talking. A clerk checked Maren's badge, wrote her name in a paper log, then guided her to a side room with warm light and a small speaker on the table. Tamsin Rowe arrived alone. Her coat hung loose, as if she had lost weight the way people lost sleep. She touched the folder with both hands and did not let go. The clerk said, "We have a message packet from Private Kale Rowe." Tamsin nodded and swallowed. Tamsin said, "Is it really him?" The clerk said, "It is the best restoration available." Tamsin looked at Maren, searching her face for honesty. Maren remembered Sarah Wile's notice. The clean wording, the lack of voice, silence could be its own kind of editing. The clerk asked for consent to play the recording. Tamsin nodded again, smaller this time, then held her breath. Static rose. Then a voice assembled itself. Kale's inhale came first, fast and close. After a broken phrase, the restored line slid in, smooth and calm. "I'm at peace." Maren felt the sentence land in the room like a sedative. The voice sounded like Kale, yet the rhythm was too even. Tamsin's face softened with relief that looked almost like pain. When the message ended, Tamsin replayed it. On the second pass, Maren caught the detail that would not let her go. In the smoothed line, Kale used the word, tranquil. His training clips never used formal words. He said, "Fine," and, "Okay." Never tranquil. Tamsin pressed her fingers to her lips. "He always hated big words," she whispered, then stopped, as if she had confessed something fragile. The clerk offered a support sheet and a quiet room in the back hall. Tamsin took the paper without reading it. Tamsin said, Can I get the raw version too? The clerk shook their head. The clerk said, only the official restoration is permitted for transfer. The answer was gentle. The boundary was not. Tamsin turned toward Maren, eyes wet but steady. Tamsin said, are you from the desk? Maren answered softly. Maren said, I restore damaged audio. Tamsin hugged the folder to her chest. Tamsin said, thank you for giving him back to me. I can sleep now. Maren could have spoken the bigger truth. One sentence could crack the comfort and let raw air rush in. She pictured the lobby outside. Strangers trying not to fall apart in public. She chose a smaller truth that still burned. Maren said, I kept the message as clear as I could. Tamsin left with the folder held like a life ring. In the lobby, a man argued about delays until a guard stepped in. The guard's calm hands told Maren the city was always one spark from chaos. Walking back into Nightglass District, Maren carried the wrong word in her head and the certainty that compassion, in this city, could be turned into a handle someone else used to steer you. Outside the side room, Tamsin paused as if dizzy, then steadied herself against the wall. She folded the support sheet without reading it and tucked it into her coat. The gesture looked automatic, like filing away bad weather. A counselor stood near the exit with a small cart of water cups and thin blankets. Her badge read Dr. Elowen Hart. She spoke softly to a young couple who kept asking for a replay they were not allowed to request. Dr. Hart noticed Maren and gave a tired nod, the kind people used when they recognized another nightworker. Dr. Hart said, the desk keeps the city from tearing itself apart. Maren did not argue. She watched Tamsin walk out into the street with a new kind of calm. Maren wondered how long that calm would last once the wrong word started to itch. Near midnight, the message annex sounded normal, yet nothing felt normal. Fans whispered behind grates. The voice-stitch console glowed. Waiting. Maren did not log in. The monitoring flag did not announce itself. But she felt it in the way her fingers hesitated above every control. Kez Talren stood near the wall screen where the relay burn map tracked interference across the Ember relay belt. Kez said, they will deny a vault request. You saw it. Maren said, I saw a mother memorize a sentence that was not her son's. Kez spoke like a technician choosing simple words. Kez said, 2 routes. One is legal. It will take weeks and end in a rejection. The other is practical. We trace the insertion signature. Altered packets carry a pattern, like a thumbprint pressed into noise. Maren said, and we do that without privileges? Kez set a plain recorder on the bench. Kez said, we read fingerprints from audio you already handled. A human who inserts a line leaves a different edge. I can measure that edge. Maren said, they will call it unauthorized. Kez said, they will call it dangerous. That is how policy protects itself. Maren said, in your culture, a last message is a contract. Kez nodded. Kez said, if the living must carry the loss, the least we owe them is the real weight. Maren looked at the empty console. Maren said, who can tell us where the chain bends? Kez said, Orrin Pike in Vault 9. He kept peacetime habits, redundancy, paper. 2 hours later, they moved through a service hatch into hush corridor. Pipes lined the narrow passage. Pumps thudded in the walls. Kez swiped a worn hush keycard and guided Maren toward a secondary door. A man opened it a handspan, then wider when he saw Kez. Orrin Pike looked tired and sharp at the same time. Orrin said, you are flagged. Maren said, I did not tell anyone. Orrin said, I read the change notices. I remember names. He let them in. The space was a staging closet with spare seals and a battered terminal. On a shelf sat a stack of paper cards, corners frayed. Orrin saw Maren stare. Orrin said, paper does not keep logs. Kez said, we think a filter stage is inserting lines. We need to know where the insertion happens. Orrin pulled a card and slid it toward them. One line was underlined. Orrin said, 3 nights ago, an unscheduled pass went through the stability lane. Not in the official custody ledger. In mine. Maren said, stability lane belongs to the Directorate of Homefront Stability. Orrin nodded. Orrin said, Yes, and they hate being questioned. Maren said, "Why help us?" Oren's gaze went to the door, as if listening. Oren said, "I used to hand families these packets. I watched them take last words like medicine. If you are right, someone is dosing them." Maren said, "If we are wrong, we will only hurt people." Oren's voice softened, but his eyes stayed hard. Oren said, "Then do not make them lose their dead twice. Bring proof, or bring silence." He folded a small slip and pressed it into Maren's palm. Oren said, "A window during a shift change. A door that sticks if you push at the hinge. Use it once, then burn it." They left before Oren could regret being kind. In the corridor, Maren held the slip and knew it was not safety. It was a chance, and chances in Kestrel Harbor were always priced. On the way out, Oren stopped Kez with a lifted finger. Oren said, "Do not come back twice. If you get caught, you get caught. If you hesitate, you drag everyone into it." Kez nodded. Kez said, "We will move clean." Oren looked at Maren again, like he was memorizing her face in case it vanished from the schedule. Oren said, "Keep your hands steady. People break things when their hands shake." By morning, the air in the annex had changed. It was the same building, the same humming power, but people stopped talking when Maren walked past. Captain Juno Keir waited at the bay door with 2 Dome Security Bureau officers. Keir said, "Maren Wyle, internal review, now." Maren said, "On what grounds?" Keir said, "Unauthorized retention of raw audio. Possible intent to distribute. Possible breach of family privacy." Kez stepped forward. Kez said, "The Signal Integrity Guild is here by request. My work is authorized." Keir looked at Kez with polite emptiness. Keir said, "Authorization can be revised." The officers moved with quiet confidence. One unplugged Kez's recorder and sealed it. Another opened Maren's drawer and removed her buffer drive. Maren said, "That never left this room." Keir said, "Retention without clearance is still retention. The Directorate does not tolerate improvised side channels." An officer asked Kez for their token. Kez handed it over. Keir said, "Signal Integrity Guild accounts are suspended on this site pending review. Your access is closed." Kez said, "You cannot close my eyes." Keir said, "No, we close doors." Keir turned a tablet so Maren could see her access attempts, all highlighted and time-stamped. Keir said, "You have been curious. Curiosity is expensive in wartime." Maren said, "I asked for confirmation on an anomaly." Keir said, "Your job is restoration, not investigation." In a small interview booth, Keir asked the same questions from different angles. "Who spoke to you? What did you copy? Why did you request vault confirmation? Did Kez Talren encourage you?" Maren kept to the least damaging truth. Maren said, "I restored a packet. I saw an anomaly. I asked for verification. I did not distribute anything." Keir said, "Do you believe the Directorate is lying to families?" Maren said, "I believe families deserve to know what was changed." Keir said, "Belief is not evidence." Keir slid a consent form across the table. Keir said, "Sign this. You acted alone. The Guild was not involved. You keep your position." Maren said, "I will not blame someone else to save myself." Keir took the form back. Keir said, "Then you will work under enhanced controls." When the interview ended, Maren returned to her console. A new banner sat in the corner of her screen. Session mirrored, outputs archived, deviations flagged. The cue tray slid forward with a fresh envelope stamped urgent. Maren read the recipient line and lost her breath. Sarah Wyle. Her sister's name, sealed inside a final packet. Delivered late enough to be cruel. Maren reached out, then stopped. Cameras watched. Logs watched. Kez whispered, "Maren?" A chime sounded. A prompt appeared on her screen. Restoration required. Monitoring active. Maren set the envelope down as if it might shatter. She understood the leash. Work while they watch, or refuse and become a warning for everyone else who ever felt doubt. Outside the dome, the Ember relay belt flickered on the public map. Truth, delayed and damaged, kept arriving anyway. Before dawn, Maren placed her hand on the seal again. Compassion had been the reason she stayed in this job. Now it was the tether they could pull whenever they wanted. Back at the bay, an officer remained near the door, pretending to study a checklist. The presence turned the room into a stage. Maren restored 2 routine packets under watch, hearing fear and tenderness scrape against static, then watching the smoothing algorithm polish the roughest edges until the pain sounded manageable. Kez said quietly, "They're using law as a blade." Maren said, "And mercy as a chain." The Sarah Wyle envelope waited in the tray, untouched. Maren felt the city pressing her toward it, toward compliance, toward the official version of her own loss. She had not even chosen to ask for this message. The system had chosen the timing for her. A notice slid onto her screen for immediate processing. It warned that delay would be treated as obstruction. Maren looked at the seal on Sarah's packet and realized they were not only watching her. They were moving her hands. Before dawn, the message annex felt too clean for grief. The monitoring banner sat in the corner of Maren Wyle's screen. Quiet and permanent, it did not warn her. It simply collected her. The sealed envelope with her sister's name waited in the tray. Sarah Wyle, ordinary ink for the one absence Maren never learned to carry. An officer from the Dome Security Bureau stood by the bay door with a paper checklist. He never looked at her directly, but she could feel the job in his stillness. Kez Talren waited at the far wall. Access suspended, hands empty. Maren slid the envelope under the scanner and set the headset on. The console chimed, then displayed a reminder about mirrored sessions. She pressed play anyway. Static rose, then a breath she recognized. Sarah always inhaled through her nose before she spoke. The restored voice that followed was smooth, almost polished. "Hey, Mare, if you are hearing this, it means my team held the line. I volunteered. I was proud." Maren's throat tightened. She had expected fear, or at least a crack in the voice. Instead, she heard the calm cadence of a public statement. She stopped playback and opened the raw track. The waveform was torn. Burn damage from the Ember relay belt. Maren lowered the restoration layer as far as the locked settings would allow. A thin seam opened in the hiss. Under the polished line, a rough whisper flickered. "Sorry, I am scared." Maren froze. The words were faint, but they were Sarah, not a symbol, a person trying to stay brave and failing for a second. She played the next segment. The part the system claimed was too damaged. The smooth track turned it into certainty. The raw track carried a few more scraps. "Tell Mom," Sarah said in the noise. Then a harsh burst swallowed the rest. A second later, a smaller sound came through. A thin laugh that did not belong in a heroic speech. It was the laugh Sarah used when she knew she was about to scare someone but did it anyway. Maren remembered a childhood storm on the coast. The two of them under a table, counting thunder. Sarah had whispered jokes between strikes. Not to be brave, but to keep Maren breathing. The memory made the room tilt. Maren pressed play again, softer this time. Under the hiss, she caught another fragment. "Do not let them," Sarah said, and the signal died. The restored version covered the gap with a line about duty and calm. Maren took the headset off and stared at her own reflection in the dark glass of the screen. Her eyes looked older than her shift badge. She realized the protocol did not only edit fear, it edited warning. It removed the words that might change how the living judged the war. Maren replayed the restored version. The confident cadence returned. It did not sound evil. It sounded helpful, and that was what made it worse. Maren said, "They did not fix her. They replaced her." Kez stepped closer, careful to remain outside camera focus. Kez said, "If we prove where the insertion happens, we can break their story." Maren stared at the confirm prompt. The system did not ask if the voice was honest. It asked if the file met standards. The officer shifted his weight. A pen scratched once on paper. A small sound that felt like a timer. Maren saved the session in a paused state. Not final, then exited with the fewest clicks. Her hands stayed steady. Her chest did not. Maren looked at the envelope again and felt the lie take shape. It was not a single kindness. It was an assembly line. Outside, Kestrel Harbor slept under dome lights that pretended the sky was gentle. Inside, Maren decided she would not let her sister be turned into a sentence the city could tolerate. The next night cycle brought a brief load shed at shift change. The kind the city used to keep the grid from sagging. Maren watched the clock the way people watched weather. She could not request a vault copy. Director Varric Sloan would deny it, and the denial would become a leash. Kez met her in Hush Corridor, where pumps made the walls tremble. Orrin Pike waited farther down, pushing a cart of seals like a man running errands. His tired eyes carried the warning he had already given. Maren said, "This has to look like work." Kez said, "It will be work. Boring work. That is why it might succeed." Their plan was plain. Maren would report a cooling spike on her console at the exact minute the load shed hit. The escort runner would walk her toward maintenance. She would turn into the utility corridor. Orrin would open the stuck hinge on the Vault 9 service door. Kez would pull one mirror segment from the custody panel during reboot. Then leave. No disguise, no heroics, just routine exploited once. Kez had spent the day in public archives, reading maintenance bulletins like a bored clerk. Buried in the notices was a pattern of short lock resets that coincided with the load shed. The pattern was not secret. It was simply ignored by anyone who did not need it. Orrin had added one more detail on the back of a seal card. A small camera above the Vault 9 service door was half blinded by condensation when the fans cycled. It softened outlines. Maren returned to her station and waited. The display flickered as the grid dipped. The officer by the door glanced up, annoyed. Maren lifted her hand. Maren said, "Cooling is spiking. If it hard shuts, we lose the queue. I need a maintenance check." A runner arrived, irritated by extra steps, and waved her out. Maren walked fast but not fast enough to look guilty. She turned into Hush Corridor at the first chance. The air smelled of metal and coolant. Kez followed at a distance, hands visible. Orrin rolled his cart in front, posture casual, as if this was his only purpose in life. At the Vault 9 service door, Orrin bent to adjust a wheel. Maren pressed at the hinge with her shoulder. The door resisted, then gave with a soft shudder. Inside, the air was colder. Fans ran harder. Everything sounded like restraint. They did not go deep. Kez moved to a side panel labeled Custody Mirror. The status light blinked, then went dark as the reboot window opened. For a few seconds, the panel was in default. Kez slid a small optical puller into the port and held it steady. The device did not crack encryption. It simply caught the mirror before it locked. A thin progress line crawled on its screen. Maren watched the hallway. Her heart kept counting without permission. The puller chirped once. Kez withdrew it and snapped the cover shut. Inside the vault, Kez did not rush. Rushing made noise, and noise created stories. Kez touched the custody mirror housing as if greeting it, then shifted their fingers to the panel edge where tiny scratches showed it had been opened before. Maren noticed the scratches and felt a new chill. This stage was not an emergency patch. It was a maintained habit. Someone had been here many times, in the same dull way a worker checked filters. When the puller finished, Kez also captured a short configuration stub, the smallest piece of text that could prove intent. It listed the stage name and a routing tag that pointed to a device upstream from Maren's console. Kez whispered, "We have it." They turned to leave. A voice met them in the corridor, calm as a closed door. "Captain Juno Keir." Keir stood with two officers, posture relaxed, as if she had been waiting for boredom to end. Keir said, "Vault work is not scheduled for your unit." Kez held up the visitor pass. "Useless as paper." Kez said, "Signal integrity consult." Keir looked at the pass and then at Maren. Keir said, "Your consult does not enter Vault 9. Orrin stepped forward, cart between them like a shield. Orrin said, "I requested a seal restock. That is on me." Keir studied him with patient eyes. Keir said, "Orrin Pike, you should know better." Orrin said, "I do. That is why I came instead of sending someone younger." Keir lifted a hand. An officer moved toward Kez. Maren did not hesitate. She stepped back as if to give space, brushed the cart handle, and caught the optical puller as it slid from Kez's pocket into her palm. Oren kept talking, keeping Keir looking at him. Oren said, "If you want discipline, discipline me." Keir said, "Whose idea was this?" Oren said, "Mine." Keir nodded once, like a form being stamped. Keir said, "Detain Oren Pike. Remove Kez Talren from the annex. Return Maren Wyle to her station under full observation." Oren's eyes met Maren's, and he gave one small shake of the head. Oren said, "Do not waste this." The officers took his arms. Seals spilled from the cart and rolled across the floor like pale coins. Oren did not fight. He kept his back straight as they led him away. Maren walked back to her station with the puller hidden in her sleeve. Her hands were steady, as he had asked. Her stomach was not. The conference room beneath the annex had sound dampening. It made the silence feel thick. Like holding your breath, Maren sat with an offline slate and the captured mirror segment opened on its screen. Kez stood beside her, escorted by an officer who watched the door. Kez was not arrested. That was not mercy. It was calculation. The mirror segment was dry, short, and damning. A hidden stage sat between restoration and delivery. Redaction filter enabled. Soft lie protocol stage active. Keyword blocks. Template substitutions. Maren opened the keyword list and felt her mouth go numb. Some entries were operational. Others were human. "I am scared. I do not want to die. Tell her I love her. I am sorry." Each had a suggested replacement. Smoother phrases that sounded brave. Maren opened a sample pair and forced herself to read it like a worker. Not like a sister. The original line was jagged. "I cannot feel my hands. I think I messed up. I love you." The delivered line was clean. "I did my duty. I am fine. I love you." The love survived, but the human cost vanished. Fear became competence. Confession became silence. In every pair, the same smoothing logic repeated, as if grief were a substance that could be diluted to a safe concentration. Another file showed a scoring field, a calm label that ranked messages as fragile, unstable, or suitable. The protocol did not treat all families the same. It predicted who might break and adjusted the dose. Maren said, "You are deciding who is allowed to handle reality." A voice answered from the door. Sloane said, "We are deciding who will still be alive tomorrow." Maren said, "They are not protecting families. They are rewriting people." Director Varick Sloane entered without hurry. No entourage, only an aide with a slate. Sloane looked rested, like someone who slept while others watched screens. Sloane sat and folded his hands. Sloane said, "You found the protocol." Maren pushed the slate forward. Maren said, "You built an assembly line for last words." Sloane glanced at the slate and did not flinch. Sloane said, "We built an assembly line for stability." Kez said, "You are manufacturing bravery." Sloane looked at Kez, calm. Sloane said, "We are manufacturing a city that still functions. When raw truth arrives at scale, people do not grieve quietly. They stampede, they riot, they sabotage waterlines because someone told them their child died screaming." Maren said, "My sister was afraid. You erased that." Sloane said, "Your sister fought anyway." Maren said, "You do not get to decide which parts of her are allowed." Sloane leaned back. Sloane said, "I get to decide what keeps Kestrel Harbor intact." Maren said, "So you dose the truth until it is safe." Sloane said, "So the living can keep living." Sloane's aide set a second slate on the table, showing a map of Kestrel Harbor with small markers. They were not troop markers. They were grief markers, clusters where disturbances had followed raw notices in the past. Sloane said, "I do not enjoy this. I hate it, but I hate mass graves more." Maren said, "So you use my hands and call it governance." Sloane said, "So I use your skill and call it survival." Maren thought of Tamsin Rowe clutching the folder like a life ring. The comfort had been real. It had also been engineered. Sloane tapped the table once. Sloane said, "You have enough to start a fire. You will not win. You will only spread damage. And you will be blamed for the damage." Maren said, "And if I stay quiet, I become your tool." Sloane nodded. as if she had been honest for years and only now was being heard. Sloane slid a short contract across the table. Sloane said, "Work with us. Officially, you will help tune the protocol so it harms fewer people. Orrin Pike receives leniency. Your mother's ration status remains stable. You keep your position." Maren looked up. Maren said, "And if I refuse?" Sloane's eyes did not change. Sloane said, "Then you become the person who breaks thousands of homes. You will be charged for illegal retention and incitement. Kez Talren will be removed from this dome. Orrin Pike will be processed as a security risk." Kez said, "This is coercion." Sloane said, "This is war." Maren stared at the contract. Her hands did not shake. Her chest did. Maren said, "You are asking me to help you turn pain into a product." Sloane stood, smoothing his coat. Sloane said, "I am asking you to choose which harm you can live with. You have one shift to decide." He left. The silence returned, thick and patient. Kez spoke low. Kez said, "We can run." Maren looked at the keyword list again. The forbidden phrases glowed like bruises. She saw Orrin's straight back as he was led away. She heard Sarah's whisper under the hiss. Maren said, "If we run, he pays. If we stay, everyone pays in a different way." Above them, the dome lights shifted toward morning. A gentle color painted over a city held together by rules and ration lines. Maren held the truth in her hands and felt how easily truth could become a weapon. When her console chimed upstairs, the sound carried through the floor like a countdown. Maren did not know yet which kind of harm she would choose. 2 nights after the vault incident, Maren Wyle sat in a small break room behind the restoration bay. The room smelled like instant broth and old paper. The hum of fans seeped through the wall, steady as a pulse. On the table lay a copied fragment of the custody mirror, reduced to plain text. Kez Talren had rewritten it by hand onto a legal pad, not because paper was safer, but because paper forced choices. Every line had to be worth the risk. Maren read the same list again, not as a worker, but as a sister. The replacements were gentle. That was the trap. Kez watched her face. Kez said, "If we throw this into the street, people will panic." Maren nodded. Maren said, "If we hide it, we become part of it." Kez said, "So we do neither." Maren set the pad down. Her voice stayed low, as if the walls could report her tone. Maren said, "We build truth with a handrail." Kez leaned in. Kez said, "Explain." Maren drew a simple flow on the pad, 3 steps that looked like a service checklist. Maren said, "We do not publish every raw line at once. We publish proof that changes exist. We publish the rules that decide changes. Then we offer families a choice." Kez said, "The system does not offer choice." That was his argument. Maren said, "Then we make it the argument he cannot attack without admitting what he built." She pointed to the list of forbidden phrases. Maren said, "We propose a choice clause. Families can request the original vault copy or the smoothed packet. The request includes support." Kez said, "Support is not bandwidth, it is people." Maren said, "We find people." Kez looked toward the hall. Kez said, "They will block any formal proposal." Maren said, "They can block a request. They cannot block a public promise if enough trusted hands carry it." A footstep paused outside the door. Maren held her breath. Then the step moved on. Slow, bored, or pretending to be. Maren said, "We need a civilian channel. A legal channel. If this is framed as sabotage, we lose." Kez said, "You know someone?" Maren thought of the lobby at the Office of Civic Closure. The counselor with the tired nod. Maren said, "Elowen Hart. She sees what grief does. She also sees what silence does." Kez said, "And law?" Maren tapped her pen once. Maren said, "Lisa Quinn, civil counsel. She fought ration penalties last winter. She knows how to keep a promise standing in a hearing." Kez held his hands open, empty and honest. Kez said, "We are asking them to risk their careers." Maren said, "We are risking more than careers already." Kez nodded, then lowered his voice. Kez said, "What do you want out of this, Maren?" Maren touched the edge of the pad where Sarah's altered message had been listed. Maren said, "I want my sister to be allowed to be human." The grid shifted outside, a brief dimming of dome light that felt like the city blinking. In the pause, Maren realized her plan had one hidden cost. It demanded patience from people already exhausted. Maren said, "The handrail has to be real. Not a slogan, not a form." Kez said, "Then we build it the way we build anything here. With small parts. With boring work." Maren looked at the mirror fragment one last time. Then folded it into her pocket. She had one shift before Sloane demanded her answer. She would use that time to build an option that did not burn the city. But also did not kneel. The next evening, Dr. Elowen Hart met them in a narrow office behind the civic closure lobby. The walls were lined with soft lighting strips and a shelf of paper cups. Outside, families waited under calm screen loops that did not match their faces. Dr. Hart closed the door and kept her hands visible, as if she understood the language of suspicion. Dr. Hart said, "You are the desk worker. The one with the tired eyes." Maren said, "I restore last messages." Dr. Hart looked at Kez. Dr. Hart said, "And you are not from here." Kez said, "Signal Integrity Guild." Dr. Hart exhaled, slow. Dr. Hart said, "What are you asking me to do?" Maren laid out the evidence without theatrics. A sample pair, a list of blocked phrases, a routing tag that proved a hidden stage existed. Dr. Hart read until her jaw tightened. Then she put the page down as if it could stain her. Dr. Hart said, "This is why some families look relieved and then fall apart a week later. The relief does not fit the loss." Kez said, "If we release this wrong, the city will spike." Dr. Hart nodded. Dr. Hart said, "Yes, it will. People need support when you remove the numbness." Maren said, "We want to offer choice. With support built in." Dr. Hart said, "Support looks like counselors on call. It looks like a quiet room that is not monitored. It looks like ration protections for families who cannot work for a day." Maren swallowed. Maren said, "Can you stand behind that?" Dr. Hart did not smile. Dr. Hart said, "I can stand behind families. I cannot stand behind a stunt." Kez said, "Then help us make it not a stunt." A knock came, sharp. Dr. Hart opened the door a fraction. A woman stepped in, coat clean, hair pinned with practical care. Her eyes scanned the room the way a lawyer scanned an accusation. "Lisa Quinn." Lisa said, "Dr. Hart, you said it was urgent." Dr. Hart said, "It is." Maren offered the pages. Lisa read fast, lips pressed thin. When she reached the keyword substitutions, she stopped. Lisa said, "They built a content filter for grief." Kez said, "Yes." Lisa set the pages down and looked at Maren. Lisa said, "If you bring this to a public panel, they will call you a destabilizer. They will say you are weaponizing private pain." Maren said, "We want to prevent collapse. That is why we want choice and support." Lisa nodded, once. Lisa said, "Good. Then we write it as a proposal, not a leak." Kez said, "They will block it." Lisa said, "Blocking is a move too. If they block, they admit they control access to original copies. That becomes the headline." Maren felt her shoulders loosen by a fraction. Not hope, but structure. Lisa pulled out a slate and began listing steps. No drama, dates, responsibilities, language that could survive a hostile reading. Lisa said, "We need witnesses, one from the desk, one from mental health, one from technical integrity." Dr. Hart said, "And we need a safety plan for families who choose the raw message." Lisa said, "Agreed. We call it a supported disclosure process. Families are offered a counselor session before and after. They can bring a friend. They can opt out at any point." Kez said, "My guild can verify tampering patterns without exposing full content." Later, when the meeting ended, Maren and Kez walked in the corridor where the lobby noise faded into ventilation. Maren said, "You could leave. Your guild can relocate you." Kez said, "I could, but then your sister stays a sentence." Maren looked at his hands. Empty and steady. Maren said, "In my family, We used to say last words should be carried gently. Kez said, gently does not mean falsely. They paused near a window strip where the dome sky glowed pale. For a moment the city felt quiet enough to hear memory. Maren said, Sarah used to laugh when she was afraid. She made jokes during storms. Kez looked at the floor. Then back up. Kez said, my brother died on a transfer barge. There was no message, only a cargo report. Kez said, I hated that emptiness. Then I came here and saw messages that were full but not true. I hated that too. Maren said, so we do this. Kez said, yes. No long confession followed. They simply kept walking, side by side, toward a future that would cost them both. By the following morning, Kestrel Harbor was already being prepared to fear them. Screens in public corridors displayed a new advisory from the Directorate of Homefront Stability. The language was careful and soft. It warned about malicious actors who wanted to exploit grief. It urged citizens to trust official channels. It suggested that instability served the enemy. In the message annex, supervisors spoke in lower voices. The Dome Security Bureau officers looked more alert, as if expecting sabotage from quiet people. Captain Juno Keir appeared at Maren's station with a sealed notice. Keir said, you are summoned to a civic integrity review. Maren took the notice. Her name was printed cleanly, like a form that could erase her. The review was scheduled for the next cycle, in a public chamber near Nightglass District. Maren said, this is not internal. Keir said, it is public, but controlled. Kez, barred from the console area, watched from behind a glass partition. His jaw tightened, but he did not move. Maren said, what is the charge? Keir said, attempted data theft, collusion with an outside entity, intent to destabilize families. Maren felt her pulse climb, then settle into focus. This was Sloane's move, not a cage, but a stage. That evening, Lisa Quinn met Maren in a back hall and read the summons. She did not look surprised. Lisa said, he is building a story before you speak. Dr. Hart arrived with a thin folder of incident patterns, showing how grief spikes had been used to justify policy in the past. Dr. Hart said, he will parade families who are grateful for the smoothed messages. Maren said, they are not wrong to be grateful. Dr. Hart said, no, they are not. That is why this is cruel. Kez stood at the end of the hall, escorted by a guard, as if his presence alone was a risk. Maren walked to him. Maren said, they are giving us a hearing, but it is not for truth. Kez said, it is for fear. Lisa leaned close. Lisa said, we can get you out before the review. Quietly, I have a transit order ready. You disappear into another district. Kez is removed by his guild contact. Dr. Hart keeps her license by claiming she was misled. Maren stared at the transit order. It was a door opening. It was also abandonment. Maren said, and Oren Pike? Lisa did not answer at first. Lisa said, I can argue for leniency later. Maren pictured Oren standing straight as seals rolled across the floor. Do not waste this. He had not asked for rescue. He had asked for purpose. Maren said, if I run, Sloane wins. He will say the saboteur fled. Kez said, if you stay, he will try to break you in public. Maren said, then I do not stand alone in public. Dr. Hart stepped forward. Dr. Hart said, if you speak, I will be there. I will say what unsupported grief does, and what supported truth can do. Lisa said, if you stay, I will file the proposal on record before the hearing starts. That forces them to respond to the plan, not only the panic. Kez looked at Maren, searching for the moment she might collapse. She did not. Maren said, we promised a handrail. We do not build a handrail and then jump off the bridge. The next day, the review chamber filled with citizens and uniformed staff. The crowd was not a riot. It was worse. It was a controlled audience, guided by screens and security lines. Director Varick Sloane sat at the center table, calm and prepared. He nodded at Maren when she entered, as if welcoming a participant in his lesson. Sloane said, Maren Wyle, you have been very busy. Maren walked to the witness stand and placed Lisa's filed proposal on the public record tray. The clerk stamped it without looking up. A murmur moved through the room. Sloane's eyes narrowed by a fraction. It was the first crack in his smooth surface. Maren looked at the crowd and chose her first sentence with care. Maren said, "I am not here to burn Kestrel Harbor. I am here to keep families from being lied to in the name of love." Sloane leaned forward. Sloane said, "Love without order is chaos." Maren did not raise her voice. Maren said, "Order without truth is a cage." The chamber held its breath. Outside, the dome sky shifted toward dusk again, the city repeating its cycle as if nothing inside it could change. Maren had a chance to escape, and she had refused it. She had chosen the harder option, not to shout, but to place truth into the hands of people who could carry it without dropping everything else. The Civic Review chamber smelled like recycled air and old varnish. Dome lights above the audience were tuned to a calming spectrum. It was soft enough to make anger look unseemly. It did not work. The crowd was quiet, but their faces held pressure, like storm fronts trapped under glass. Maren Wyle stood at the witness stand with her hands on the rail. A camera tracked her eyes. A clerk's stamp sat ready on the record tray. Director Varick Sloane watched from the center table, posture composed, as if he had been here 1,000 times. Lisa Quinn sat to Maren's left with a thin binder and a pen that never stopped moving. Dr. Elowyn Hart sat behind them, shoulders squared, prepared to be hated for saying grief had rules. Kez Talren stood at the technical lectern with a single slate. His guild badge had been deactivated, but he wore it anyway, not as a credential, but as a reminder that integrity was still something a person could claim. Sloane's voice carried without effort. Sloane said, "Maren Wyle has filed a document requesting a change to wartime communications policy. She claims our restoration process alters messages. She implies malice. We are here to determine whether her actions constitute sabotage." A murmur ran through the room. A woman in the front row clutched a message folder the way Tamsin Rowe had. Another man stared at the floor, jaw working, as if swallowing words he did not want in public. Maren kept her tone steady. Maren said, "I am not here to accuse families of being weak. I am here to show that the system is deciding, without consent, which parts of a person are allowed to reach home." Sloane lifted a hand. Sloane said, "Show us your proof." Lisa nodded once. Maren slid the first exhibit onto the record tray. It was a custody chain extract from Vault 9, copied and verified in front of Dr. Hart and Lisa. The clerk stamped it and projected it to the wall. Maren spoke like a worker reading a maintenance bulletin. Maren said, "This document shows a stage inserted between restoration and delivery. It is labeled Soft Lie Protocol. It is not a repair tool. It is a content filter." Someone in the audience said, "A lie?" And the word hung in the air like smoke. Maren did not flinch. Maren said, "It replaces certain phrases. It removes fear, apology, and warning language. It keeps the parts that are easier to hear." Sloane's eyes stayed calm. Sloane said, "Restoration always includes smoothing. People misunderstand technical terms." Maren said, "Then show the desk's consent form. Show where families agreed to have meaning change." Sloane's jaw tightened by a fraction. Sloane said, "Families want comfort, not technical debates." Dr. Hart raised her hand. The chair recognized her. Dr. Hart said, "Families want what they can carry. Comfort can be real, but comfort that is built on an unchosen lie often breaks later. That break looks like depression, violence, collapse at work. I see it." Sloane turned toward her, polite and sharp. Sloane said, "Doctor, do you see riots? Do you see stampedes at airlocks? Do you see what happens when panic hits a ration line?" Dr. Hart did not back away. Dr. Hart said, "I see people when they are alone with what happened. I also see what denial does. It delays grief. It does not remove it." Sloane stood, and the room quieted as if trained. Sloane said, "Let us speak plainly. Last year, we lost 3,000 to combat an accident across the Ember relay belt. When raw casualty reports leaked in another dome, the crowd rushed the exits. The air processing failed. People suffocated in corridors because they could not wait their turn to leave. A hush dropped over the room. The story was not new, but hearing it in this chamber made it present. Sloane looked at Maren. Sloane said, "Would you like to be responsible for that here?" Maren felt the question try to hook into her. She did not answer with pride. She answered with a boundary. Maren said, "I will not pretend your fear is fake. I will also not accept that the only choices are silence or fire." Lisa stood, voice crisp. Lisa said, "We are not proposing uncontrolled disclosure. We are proposing a supported disclosure process with an explicit choice. Families can request the original, or they can accept the softened version. They do not lose access either way. They gain consent." Sloane smiled without warmth. Sloane said, "Consent does not stop a mob." Maren said, "Support does. Preparation does. Trust does." Maren leaned slightly forward, not to intimidate, but to reach. Maren said, "If you fear chaos, then build the handrail you have been refusing to build." Kez added one last technical note in plain speech. Kez said, "The filter runs on keywords. That means it is not tailored to a family's needs. It is tailored to the state's needs." Sloane's gaze sharpened. Sloane said, "The state's needs are survival." Maren said, "And survival without truth becomes a slow death." When the chair called a recess, the audience did not disperse. They clustered in small knots, whispering as if the dome might hear them. In the side corridor, Maren washed her hands at a sink that dispensed water in small measured spurts. Her fingers shook for the first time all week, then steadied when she pressed them against the cool basin. Kez stood beside her, facing the hall like a guard without a weapon. Maren said, "He is going to show numbers until people beg him to keep lying." Kez said, "Numbers are his shield, but he bleeds too." Maren turned. Maren said, "What do you mean?" Before Kez could answer, Lisa arrived with a note stamped by the chair. Lisa said, "They will allow Sloane to present a personal statement. He asked for it." Back in the chamber, Sloane stepped away from the table and stood in front of the projection wall. The lights dimmed slightly, as if the room wanted to be kinder to him. Sloane said, "I built the soft lie protocol after I watched people die in a shelter corridor." He did not look at Maren. He looked past her, toward a memory. Sloane said, "I was a junior logistics officer in Dome Cardin. A transport hit the outer shield. We lost heat. We lost oxygen margin." Sloane said, "People lined up at the exits because the rumor was that the dome was failing. It was not failing. It could have held, but panic became physics. Bodies became a blockage. Air became debt." The room stayed silent. Even those who hated him listened. His voice did not tremble, which made the story colder. Sloane said, "My wife was in that corridor. She was not a soldier. She was a nurse. She died with her hand on the wall, waiting for the line to move." Sloane's eyes finally met Maren's. Sloane said, "Afterward, I promised myself I would never again allow mass grief to turn into mass death. If I had to be hated for preventing it, I would be hated." Maren stood when the chair recognized her. Her voice came out low, not angry. Maren said, "I believe you loved her. I believe you are still trying to save her by saving everyone." Sloane's eyes narrowed. Maren said, "But you did not build a handrail. You built a lock, and you did it without consent." Sloane said, "Consent is a luxury in collapse." Maren said, "Consent is also the difference between support and control." Dr. Hart spoke, careful and firm. Dr. Hart said, "Director Sloane, I do not deny that panic kills. But withholding truth does not prevent panic forever." Dr. Hart said, "It postpones it until it erupts in private. In homes, in clinics, in suicides no one counts." Sloane looked at her, and for a moment his composure slipped into fatigue. Sloane said, "And if we do what she wants and the city breaks?" Maren answered before anyone could turn the moment into rhetoric. Maren said, "Then we build safety into the choice. We do not throw families into raw loss alone." Maren said, "We do not dump every message onto the street. We start with a pilot. With counselors. With quiet rooms. With ration protections. We let people choose when they can hold it." Lisa added, "And we track outcomes. If your fear is correct, The data will show it. If it is not, your protocol is harming people for nothing. The chair called for a vote among the panel members. The result was not dramatic. It was administrative, which was the only kind of victory the dome could tolerate. The chair said, Director Sloan will sign a transparency covenant. The soft lie protocol will be disclosed to families. The chair said, a supported disclosure process will be established under joint oversight from Civic Closure, Civil Council, and Signal Integrity Review. Sloan's mouth tightened. He looked like a man swallowing something bitter that he had brewed himself. The chair continued. Vault original copies will remain sealed by default. Families may request access. Requests must include a support session. No one is required to hear raw content. A murmur rose, not of anger, but of breath being released. Sloan stood slowly. Sloan said, this will cost us. The enemy will exploit our openness. Maren said, it will also cost us if we keep pretending people are not human. Sloan picked up the covenant slate and signed. The sound of the stylus was small, but it landed heavy in the room. Afterward, as people filed out, some avoided Maren's eyes, some nodded. One older man paused and held up his folder. He said, so I can choose? Maren answered softly. Maren said, yes, you can choose. Outside, dome lights shifted toward evening again. Work shifts would continue. Water would still be rationed. The war would still grind on. Nothing had been saved completely. Kez walked beside Maren toward the annex. Kez said, they will watch you forever. Maren said, they already were. Kez said, you might be reassigned. Maren said, maybe, but the desk changed. They passed the office of Civic Closure. Dr. Hart stood at the entrance, already speaking to a family in low, steady tones. A small sign had been hung near the door. Supported message choice. Quiet room available. Maren stopped for a moment and watched. It was not a miracle. It was a handrail, built from boring work and hard honesty. She thought of Sarah again. Not as a perfect hero, but as a frightened woman who still showed up. Maren could not bring her back, but she could stop the system from turning her into a sentence that belonged to someone else. Maren said, truth does not resurrect anyone. Kez looked at her. Maren said, but it lets the living keep walking without losing themselves. Truth will not bring the dead back. It will not warm an empty chair, or refill the space beside a pillow, but it can give the living something the war keeps trying to steal. The right to grieve what was real, and the strength to keep going anyway. In Kestrel Harbor, the last message desk did not become a weapon or lullaby. It became a choice, held with care, so every family could take the truth at the pace their hands could bear. And in that small, steady change, hope did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as a handrail, and a promise that no one would be made to lose their loved one twice. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so more listeners can find these quiet futures. And so we can keep telling science fiction that feels real, human, and worth holding onto.